Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on thematic evaluation 2 study lessons on BHA surge funding. My name is Dr. Shalene Collins. I'm with Tulane University, and I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Peak, who is a senior M&E advisor at BHA and the activity manager for this evaluation, to make some opening remarks.
Thanks, Shalene. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Nancy Peak. I'm the Senior Monitoring and Evaluation Advisor with the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance M&E, doing the performance and thematic evaluations of BHA's COVID-19 response from 2020 to 2022. It goes without saying that the COVID-19 pandemic was a crisis unlike any other.
There may be some technical difficulties. I can go ahead and introduce our team. So like I said, my name is Shalene Collins. Thematic 2 study was primarily led by myself and Tim Frankenberger, who is also on the call, Suzanne Nelson, Marietta Valle, who is my co-lead in this evaluation on the Tango side, Tommaso Russo, Dr. Nancy Mock, who's also at Tulane University, Aaron Frankenberger, Aaron Franklin, and Tripura Taladadevi, and with inputs from many others on the Tango Tulane team, with support from Purdue University and the Laser Pulse team. And we could go ahead to the next slide. So to give you a bit of an overview of what we're going to discuss today, we'll give you a background on our evaluation and Thematic 2 methods and how we came to this question, Thematic 2 question, present our evaluation findings with some support from Kenya and Jordan case studies, and we will present our conclusions and recommendations. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the thematic evaluations, they were separate from our performance evaluations, which we will link to at the end of the slideshow. And it should be noted that we will be presenting a separate webinar on the thematic 1, pandemic preparedness capacities in humanitarian settings tomorrow. But the purpose of these thematic evaluations was to conduct in-depth thematic analyses into aspects of BHA's FY20 to FY 2022 COVID-19 response, with a particular focus on improved future management of large-scale infectious disease outbreaks and global emergencies. Next slide, please. So the rationale for this thematic 2 is that over time, emergency funding to BHA and legacy Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, OFDA, and Food for Peace has proportionally increased over the past decade in response to crises, as you'll see in further slides. And supplemental funding is a mechanism that can allow rapid mobilization mid-year to address some of the most severe humanitarian crises and bolster existing budgets. And while supplemental funding isn't necessarily new, the scale and magnitude of the COVID-19 FY20 and 2021 and other supplemental awards was extraordinary and unprecedented in response to a confluence of global emergencies. And we know that as large-scale shocks increase in frequency, severity, and complexity, effective management of surge funding will continue to be a critical concern for BHA and its partners. And we also know that there are potential consequences, unintended positive and negative consequences of surge funding. And so that's what we were hoping to be able to parse a little bit more through this thematic study. Next slide, please. Our thematic 2 research study was framed around 4 questions. And so the first was to examine the extent of surge funding programming or operational impacts for USAID for humanitarian assistance, look at the benefits and unintended consequences of surge funding for BHA's implementing partners and for communities that had received assistance, and then harvest promising practices of the FY 2021 supplemental that could potentially guide future surge funding. And I should make a note, if you have any questions along the way, please use the Q&A function, and we will be sure to try to answer your questions in real time, but also circle back at the end. So moving into methods, next slide, please. We relied on mixed methods research to conduct this evaluation. And so some of the methods included document review, review of all available data on multiple overlapping supplemental awards from FY20 through FY 2022. We held 30 key informant interviews with 80 interviewees across BHA's implementing partners that had received more than one supplemental award. We had in-depth qualitative interviews with BHA and focus group discussions with program participants or affected communities. And we were really trying to get at the question of the impacts of following do no harm or no regrets programming to assess the impacts of surge funding. And we also drew upon multiple case studies, but in particular here we focused on WFP, World Food Program, WFP awards in Kenya and Jordan. And our rationale for selecting Kenya and Jordan were that they had both specifically expanded programming to urban refugee households in these countries, but which were novel populations for this particular award. And I'll get into that later as I'm discussing the case studies. And all of our findings were framed using a predetermined criteria to assess the potential risks. So whether it was low, moderate, or high risk, and benefits of allocation and programming decisions. Next slide, please. As I stated previously, we know that emergency funding to BHA and legacy OPTA and FFP has proportionally increased in the past decade in response to global crises. And so reviewing the total award allocation amounts to legacy OPTA and FFP and BHA from annual budget information, you can see that there are major increases with the light blue being OPTA, the dark blue being FFP, and then the dotted gray line being a combination of both leading into BHA funding. And so we know that the implementation of surge funding may likely have unintended benefits and consequences just based purely, or we sort of assumed and framed the assumptions of this evaluation around this as a way to understand the impacts of surge funding. And we know that surge funding can provide critical support, but may also strain BHA's operations. Next slide, please. And so what we found when we analyzed award data was that across waves of surge funding, and here we really focus on three surge awards. So the FY 2020 COVID-19 award, which was evaluated by our team as well. The FY 2021 award, which is the primary focus of the performance evaluation of this award and also brought into the thematic evaluation studies. And the Ukraine 2 supplemental. And although there were 3 Ukraine supplementals that were dispersed during the lifetime of the FY20 to FY 2021 award periods, we really chose to focus on the Ukraine 2 supplemental because it was it scaled up BHA's response to the global food security crisis in impacted countries during FY 2022. And so if you look at the distribution of surge awards across waves of funding, awards were largely allocated to the same countries and partners. 25 awardees across 34 countries received both the FY20 and FY 2021 COVID supplementals. 29 awardees across 36 countries received the FY 2021 and Ukraine 2 supplementals, and 16 awardees across 29 countries received all 3 supplementals. And so for the IPs that received all 3 supplementals, there was a mean of about 112 days between the end of the FY 2020 and onset of FY 2021 award, and about 148 days, so about 21 weeks, between the end of FY 2021 and the onset of the Ukraine 2 supplemental awards. And so you can start to see how there could potentially be this disruption, both from a programmatic standpoint, but also from a planning standpoint. And I'll sort of get into what the implications of these awards were as we proceed in this presentation. But it should be noted that 14 awards had an overlap between the 2 COVID supplementals, and 7 awards had overlap between the FY 2021 and Ukraine supplementals. And then countries such as Somalia, Jordan, and Syria received all three. And so moving into our evaluation findings. Next slide, please. What we found from our evaluation for this thematic 2 study is that BHA developed processes and tools that allowed for better management of surge funding. And so things such as the budget evaluation team and needs-based starting point really allowed for a better understanding of how to make strategic decisions around budget allocation. And so the BET was created during the FY 2021 supplemental to ensure collective strategic decisions around budget allocation, and it's proven impactful and has continued its role post supplemental, has been maintained as a process within BHA. The needs-based starting point was a valuable tool that has been developed to inform budget decisions based on predetermined criteria, focusing on needs and vulnerability. And so seeing the shift toward more strategic management of awards is overall a promising practice that we were able to glean from this study. From the evaluation of the FY 2020 awards, we found that the implementation period, so from the time of award allocation through implementation was about 6 to 9 months. And so with the FY 2021 award, the longer duration, the 12-month duration of implementation really allowed for more flexibility in programming, and awardees were able to more strategically plan and have sustained engagement with populations affected by the pandemic's secondary impacts. We also found expanded coverage. So in response to COVID-19, many to the primary effects, so the actual disease itself, the COVID sort of health impacts, but also the secondary impacts such as food insecurity and protection concerns really led to a need to expand coverage both vertically and horizontally. So reaching new populations, but also providing more assistance to existing populations that were being served. And what we found is that some IPs expanded into urban areas, peri-urban areas, and within new vulnerable groups, such as Indigenous populations, for example. Although we did find that in some cases, the expanded caseload overwhelmed resources, and without additional supplemental funding, didn't have the same level of durability that you would hope. We also found that there was sufficient flexibility to meet multi-sectoral needs. And so the FY 2021 supplemental provided more opportunities to address multi-sectoral humanitarian needs. And BHA was flexible to adapt activities as needed by partners. And the idea of flexibility, or the theme of flexibility, came up throughout our interviews. People mentioned needing to shift to novel populations if conflict broke out, for example. And so that was really highlighted as a promising practice. And then strong community engagement and communication was also noted as a promising practice. And so community involvement played a critical role in allowing IPs to target and retarget for vulnerability as needed, and especially in places where there were limited resources to expand across the population. There was one case study in particular that the implementing partner had worked very closely with local organizations and were able to scale up and scale down and sort of address needs dynamically. And we also found that in some cases, the strong community involvement and involvement of local partners was really critical in being able to identify populations that are typically more difficult to reach. Next slide, please. And so some of the benefits that we found of surge funding for BHA's partners is that surge funding enabled significant benefit, including expanded access to vulnerable populations and greater flexibility in response to shifting needs. However, it did also create challenges due to inadequate scale-down planning and stretched resources in some communities, creating unintended negative consequences. And so although there was the ability to expand caseloads in some instances, it was anticipated that implementing partner BHA's implementing partners would expand caseloads into populations that had not previously been reached, which required pretty Herculean efforts in some cases to identify those populations, conduct rapid vulnerability reassessments, and try to allocate resources responsibly in response to that. And so some IPs worked with community partners, as I had indicated previously, to ensure that individuals who are most vulnerable to the secondary impacts of COVID were reached, even with limited resources. And BHA's flexibility enabled partners to be able to shift their programming in response to evolving crises, such as conflict. And so this is just an illustrative quote, one of many that was pulled out during the evaluation, that we are lucky that BHA is an incredibly flexible donor and understands the flexibility required in these types of responses. BHA is truly our partner in how we work together. And this was echoed numerous times. I think the understanding of BHA and the knowledge of what the field context was like, I think was really helpful in supporting partners to be able to program appropriately. Next slide, please. However, we also found some unintended adverse consequences of surge funding for partners. One of the most frequently mentioned was staff turnover within BHA, which complicated implementation, as discussions and approaches that might have been agreed on previously might have been lost during transitions between award managers. And so our overall recommendation for that is just better continuity and handover protocols. Also, insufficient scale down planning. So a lack of built-in scale down planning led to rapid scaling up and then scaling down of staffing and programming, which adversely impacted participants once funding subsided. And dependence on unsustainable funding streams. And so layered but unpredictable supplemental awards created a reliance in the budget on these streams of funding that were anticipated to be coming down the pipeline, but might not necessarily. And so it led to disruptions when the funding ended. And then safety concerns for implementing partner staff. So in areas with dramatic reductions in assistance, program participants voiced their frustration. And this also posed safety risks to IP staff and also researchers during this evaluation. And misinformation and distrust is sort of an outcome of that. And so sudden cessation of assistance increased conflict and violence and distrust and spread of misinformation. And this was especially true in contexts that had received quite a bit of funding over long periods of time. And then risks of overcommitting. And so IPs expanded quickly in some cases, but faced issues like staff layoffs, reduced assistance, and strained relationships, and were sometimes unable to meet expectations. And so I would like to highlight two of our case studies. And so World Food Program Jordan really did an excellent job scaling up efficiently. I think in interviews with them, they said it's sort of easy to scale up a well-oiled machine. And that was certainly the case from our findings from this evaluation. So WFP Jordan was able to rapidly retarget resources to meet the need of vulnerable refugee households. And so prior to the supplemental, the primary focus of award participants in Jordan were Syrian refugees, and acknowledging that there was heightened vulnerability among non-Syrian refugees, especially those living in urban areas. WFP Jordan rapidly expanded their conducted a retargeting exercise, and were able to expand their awards to reach non-Syrian refugees, and we're also able to quickly mobilize resources using contactless or low contact modalities, and have remained engaged with communities to ensure awareness around changes to levels of assistance. And so through our assessment of WFP Jordan's response, we found that they had, help desks in camps and communities, regular SMS messaging, WhatsApp groups, Facebook pages, which allowed program participants to connect with WFP and provided ample pathways for accountability, but also allowed WFP to communicate whether or not assistance would be scaled down in conjunction with the awards that they were receiving or the funding streams that they anticipated receiving. WFP Jordan was also able to have to conduct a mobile money pilot and also a study of restricted versus unrestricted cash, which really illustrates the forward-thinking nature of the organization with positive receipt from program participants. Next slide, please. Another case study example that we'd like to highlight is WFP Kenya, which was what we consider to be a scale down success. So WFP Kenya had very proactive planning and strong community engagement, which helped them manage the scale down of surge funding more effectively, ensuring smoother transitions for participants. Their preparedness, which stemmed from prior simulations and cross-training of staff. So, for example, drivers who could conduct, M&E or be enumerators in the field, for example, or logisticians who are able to do data cleaning. The sort of cross-training of staff allowed for a rapid and efficient response during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we really want to highlight that WFP Kenya was able to maintain a really lean, agile staffing model, which is one of our overall recommendations for ensuring sufficient and effective scale up and scale down. Next slide, please. And so some of the benefits of surge funding for communities included that overarchingly, I think surge funding made major contributions to improving outcomes and was largely perceived to be life-saving. And so implementing partners and communities that received assistance emphasized the importance of the funding for households and communities to meet short-term food security and protection needs in particular. And so famine prevention and gender-based violence reduction were really mitigated and aligned with the strategic focus on targeting these two areas during the FY 2021 COVID-19 supplemental. And so what we found is that the strategic focus worked in terms of improving food security outcomes and improving protection outcomes. And we also found the successful integration of protection across all awards, or many awards. And this was guided by a BHA directive and was highly successful in addressing community vulnerabilities. We found that communities highlighted the importance of surge funding in meeting immediate food security needs, though some used cash assistance to pay off debts at the expense of nutrition outcomes. And so there was really a focus on providing assistance, quickly to meet immediate needs, but less focused on longer term resilience and recovery. And so we'll discuss that later as one of our recommendations. And then finally, in Kenya, we found that surge funding provided an economic buffer, and when combined with recovery activities, helped recipients revive small businesses and created a buffer that reduced economic backsliding after the supplemental had ended. Some unintended adverse consequences of surge funding for communities included uncertainty for program participants. So participants in several regions were not properly informed about when their assistance would end, leaving them unprepared for sudden funding shortages. And this was a downstream effect of a lack of transparency across the board in surge funding allocations, and then a post-funding decline in well-being. And so in South Sudan, the end of funding resulted, for example, resulted in reduced access to health and nutrition services, increasing risks of malnutrition, maternal mortality, and gender-based violence as women traveled further to reach clinics. And across context, newly reached groups struggled to maintain gains after funding ended with consequences, including school truancy and increased dependence on aid. Next slide, please. So moving into our conclusions and recommendations, perhaps one of the largest contributions of this study is this surge funding framework. And this framework illustrates the pathways by which that BHA could use the sort of like known context and vulnerability, even before a shock occurs. We're calling this pre-shock assessment to understand the absorptive capacity of IPs to bolster strategic thinking around award allocation. And so we know that once a shock occurs, there is sometimes congressional approval of surge funding, and the BHA receives that funding and feeds into country assessments and the severity of crisis and begins sort of building a strategy for response. And so this framework really highlights some of our key recommendations, such as integrating the needs-based starting point and other tools and processes that BHA has already developed, in addition to real-time monitoring, evaluation, and learning that can feed into pre-shock assessments and build a really robust database of lessons learned that can be harvested for future responses. Next slide, please. And so some of our recommendations for BHA include, for award management, include incorporating processes and tools, including the BETS, the needs-based starting point, SHARP, and our surge funding framework to guide award decisions, factoring in context vulnerability, past lessons, and partner capacity to absorb surge funding in pre-shock assessments. As noted in our performance evaluation, PIOs received the majority of funding for this supplemental, the FY 2021 supplemental. And so understanding absorptive capacity of IPs could really allow for perhaps more diverse distribution of awards, and ensuring programming continuity by addressing staff turnover with strong handover protocols is one of our key recommendations. Although there was a heavy focus on flexibility of BHA, the inconsistencies between handover protocols was something that was highlighted as a key recommendation that we could make moving forward. And then strengthening local organizations' capacity to reach hard to reach populations through integrated support and award allocation, allowing longer timeframes for programming and off-ramp planning to avoid steep funding cliffs that happen after surge funding ends, and implementing staggered funding with built-in monitoring and recovery provisions to allow for better accountability and impact evaluation. Next slide, please. Some of our recommendations for humanitarian partners are to incorporate agile programming and cross-training. So as I said previously, lean staffing models to more efficiently scale up and down, deploy real-time monitoring to inform dynamic programming, and build early recovery into awards during the planning process to improve durability of impacts after programming ends. Next slide, please. Some of our conclusions are that supplementals do provide much needed support to address pressing humanitarian needs, but strained BHA and IPs significantly because the need to rapidly mobilize a large amount of resources and the unprecedented global emergencies of recent years, we know provide an opportunity for learning, but do create strain. And so more strategic planning and clear processes for moving forward needed. And we believe that the surge funding framework, in conjunction with processes and tools such as the needs-based starting point, the BET, and the SHARP, could be those strategic frameworks and processes that could feed into future management of supplemental awards. And overall, BHA should support implementing partners to engage in regular or real-time monitoring to scale up and down activities and retarget resources, and provide guidance on how to slowly taper programming toward the end of award life, or hold implementing partners accountable for ensuring sufficient tapering or off-ramp. And introducing conditionality into awards could ensure flexibility, accountability, and proper off-ramp planning during crises. Next slide, please. And so strategic BHA leadership during the FY 2021 supplemental resulted in significant gains in food security protection and gender equity, or at least in some cases prevented backsliding into worse outcomes. So we recommend, continued strategic thought leadership. Strengthening local actors' capacity is critical for long-term sustainability and rapid development, and ensuring that surge funding is marginalized communities and difficult to reach communities. Cross-training staff for multifunctional roles improves agility, enables rapid scale-up and lean staffing, which BHA and IP should continue to support. And finally, implementing continuous process monitoring and investing in early recovery, risk reduction, and resilience activities can sustain long-term impacts and reduce future humanitarian costs. Thank you so much for attending this webinar, and apologies for the rocky technology start. We would like to open it up for questions at this time, and there may be some questions in the Q&A box. If you have not had a chance to add your questions in there, please feel free to do so. We would like to also point you to the annex for our case study reports and other supplementary information if you're interested. You can also find our other deliverables of this COVID evaluation series at these links that will be provided, and I can be reached at this email address here. I would like to turn it over now to Tim Frankenberger to make any final comments.
Yes, thanks, Shalene. One of the things that I was very excited about engaging in both the 2020 and 2021 evaluations was it allowed us to look at the whole picture of BHA and the way that BHA was programming resources, the way it made decisions on targeting, and we actually were very impressed with how quickly resources were moved out there, and we believe that these kinds of evaluations that we engage in are good learning opportunities for BHA, and we would encourage that maybe something like this should be done for the Ukraine supplemental as well, not just the COVID-19 one. There was one thing I really wanted to emphasize is that if we are brought in to do an evaluation, it's really important to do it real time rather than wait 2 years after the money is allocated, because oftentimes, because of the staff turnover and a lot of these places, the programming stopped, we don't get a real picture of what really was going on as it was happening. So I want to really encourage that this real-time monitoring is going to be critical so adaptive management can be done for these projects as we go forward. We also believe that BHA is putting in place mechanisms that will allow them to be more efficient, more effective, and we encourage them to continue to use these tools for that purpose. And we offer up the surge framework that we've put together just as another potential tool that will help them make better decisions with regards to the programming. I'd like to turn it over to Nancy Peak first before we talk to questions. And Nancy, do you have any comments that you want to make?
Hi, thanks, Tim, Shalene. Yeah, apologies, everyone. I know another thing COVID taught us was how to deal with technical difficulties with aplomb. So, just quickly want to say that I've had the privilege of managing this performance and thematic evaluations on behalf of BHA of the COVID-19 response. And I think looking back, fortunately, in the midst of the professional and personal chaos created by COVID-19, USAID and BHA had the foresight to recognize the importance of generating key learning from the response. So early on, BHA commissioned the extensive multi-year effort, and we invested in a number of evaluation and learning products. So I hope you found something new and interesting in the findings from this thematic evaluation. And this thematic report is just one of several products that's coming out of this effort. I know there was a link to a number of other briefs for performance evaluations, and tomorrow we have another webinar focusing on building pandemic capacities in fragile and conflict-affected settings. So thank you for joining us today. I want to say thank you to the evaluation team for your thorough and tireless work over the last few years, multiple years. So I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and questions, and now we can move on to Q&A. Thanks.
There was one question that was asked by Lee. So wanted to know where financial auditing was in our framework. Shalene, you want to take a shot at that?
Just pulling up the framework here. So I think financial auditing is part of our understanding of how an assessment of institutional mechanisms and whether or not IPs can responsibly absorb surge funding. So I know you saw the framework pretty quickly, but that's kind of part of it is whether or not IPs actually have the capacity. But then after the distribution of resources, being able to monitor the effectiveness in real time, either through having real time monitoring dashboards that are visible to BHA or shared with BHA regularly, to understand sort of where is the money going in real time, I think is something that we have recognized would be really impactful in being better able to understand the ability of some IPs to be able to responsibly absorb and program surge funding. Tim, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's right. For those of you who do have questions, because you can't turn your mute off, if you have a question, please type it in the question and answers box. So here's another one. What were the most important challenges in terms of gender issues?
And so in terms of, I would say COVID-19, we know from the empirical literature that some of the most important challenges were gender-based violence, exposure to child maltreatment, child protection concerns, and often COVID lockdowns led to victims being in close proximity with perpetrators. We have discussed much of this in our second performance evaluation brief under Objective 3, which specifically covers protection concerns and discusses some of the issues with gender, as well as the successes of using gender disaggregated data, for example, and really making protection a key strategic point to be addressed during the FY 2021 supplemental. So I would like to direct you to brief 2 and Objective 3 under brief 2. Thanks for your question.
Okay, Lee has another question. Can we tell taxpayers that corruption was avoided?
Tim, do you want to address that one?
Well, that's a tough one. I think in most cases it was avoided. I think there are some examples, and BHA is well aware of this, that there was some diversion in some countries. And so I think that they've done a good job at trying to have lessons learned of why that happened and how to prevent that in the future. So I think, Nancy, you might want to say something about that.
Thanks. Yes. Yeah, I think definitely there's been a lot of reflection and learning, as we've come down from the huge supplementals and surge funding from COVID in Ukraine, that where there were instances of program irregularities, why and how did that happen? Where can we be better? Where can our implementing partners be better? And I think this evaluation is definitely just has provided further sort of inputs into that broader conversation as well.
Yeah. No, I think when we were interviewing different case studies and people from the different countries, they were well aware of it and were taking steps to try to prevent it from happening in the future. So I think that given the amount of resources that were moved out in such rapid fashion, I think the fact that there wasn't more of it is a miracle. So I think that's been good. Was there any analysis on the types of assistance modalities and efficiency or cost effectiveness? This is what Holly is asking us.
Yes, there was. And so we found that during COVID, the COVID FY20 and COVID FY 2021 supplementals, there was a shift toward remote modalities. And with great perceived success, through our performance evaluation, we have highlighted that remote modalities in some cases allowed for better reach in terms of meeting vulnerable populations who might not necessarily be able to, to use, like vouchers, for example, in terms of food security. We found, like in places with supportive technologies and facilitating environments to conduct, mobile money transfers, that sort of thing, that they were very efficient and cost effective, more cost effective in some cases. We also found that, protection modalities, protection remote modalities such as apps. I mean, there was a really good case study example that we highlighted from the review of award documents and key informant interviews in our performance evaluation brief, of like a quick closing app, for example, that would be a little bit more discreet and allow for a person to access protection referral services or without necessarily being as visible to a potential perpetrator who might be sharing a phone. So we found many, many examples of changes and really innovative uses of different modalities that improved efficiency and cost effectiveness that are in continued use today. Tim, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's good. Julie has a question. She wanted to know if our evaluation also looked at the complementarity or fragmentation of USG COVID-19 supplementary funding across various agencies and how that impacted assistance and technical cooperation and delivery by IPs. So yes, I think we did try to do that. I don't know if you want to take a shot at that.
Yeah, sure. So we did. Our primary focus was on BHA funding, though we tried to understand the impacts across various agencies as well. Here we focused on the thematic two. We did focus primarily on BHA funding, just because, sort of trying to limit the scope. But in across our evaluation, we've sort of looked at the overlap of funding received across various agencies and various bureaus.
Right. Okay. So our friend from Kenya wants to know, it's kind of complimentary of what we did in terms of our study, but wants to know if we can share these reports with government partners.
Yeah, I mean, I think these will be publicly available, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you are interested, our performance evaluation documents that are publicly available will be linked, as well as our thematic evaluation briefs. So they will be open access and can be read, distributed, shared.
Thanks, Peter. Any other questions or comments? Doesn't seem to be. Last chance. Oh, here's one. That's Erin. Erin's just put in there that she just put into the chat where you can access these documents. You have any closing comments you want to make, Shalene?
I just want to thank everyone for your attendance and your attention during this webinar. Apologies again for our technology issues in the beginning, but thank you for bearing with us. And we hope that you will feel inspired to look into our thematic report, which gives you far more context and more detail about what was briefly discussed today. And we also want to turn your attention to the performance evaluation briefs, which cover some of the other topics that were brought up during the Q&A session today. We thank you all for your time and attention. And if there are no further questions, I think we can adjourn.
Marietta, do you want to say something?
I was just going to put in one final plug then. If around the same time, well, this time starting tomorrow, we will have our sister thematic evaluation webinar. And I think the registration link just got popped into the chat. And so a little more on what we're covering with that one. For that thematic study, we were looking at pandemic preparedness capacities that were supported during the COVID response in humanitarian settings. And we look at the humanitarian architecture, different levels, using the Health Emergencies Preparedness and Resilience Framework from WHO, what are these different capacities for future pandemics that were built at the community level, at the IP or country level. Also looking a little bit more at BHA and USG coherence for preparing for those pandemics, and then at the global and regional levels. So again, we'll be highlighting a few really important cases and case studies as we did for WFP Kenya and Jordan today, and hope that if you're interested, you can join that. Also, we are really happy to respond to any other questions that maybe didn't quite get answered. And so do feel free to reach out. Shalene's email is the very end of the slide deck, which has already been posted in the links that have been provided. So hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
Nancy Mock, do you want to say anything?
Hold on. Yes. Yes, I just wanted to say that, coming back to the big picture here, that this was such an extraordinary situation. And, and the various issues that were identified are an attempt to really just strengthen the systems that respond to what we expect to be more of these kinds of situations. So, I think we all have to look at the context and how, this was quite an unprecedented. Surge is not unprecedented, but this level of surge and the concatenation of conflict and pandemics was over.
Thanks. Nancy, do you have anything? Nancy Peak, do you have anything else to want to say?
No, just that I encourage you all to dig into the all of the reports and other resources. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I guess we can say goodbye. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.